everybody, I'm Lizzie, and I'm going to be talking about mentoring and coaching. So first off, I love mentoring and coaching. I've been doing this in some form or another for about 10 years. I've helped at all of the Rails Girls here in Sydney. I started my own study group, and I offer advice to people who ask for it. I found that this can be a better way to help me organize my thoughts and to learn new things. It also helps me broaden my network. And I noticed as I was coming in, there are a lot of Rails Girls people here. So if you have been to a Rails Girls, or if you applied to the next one, can you just raise your hand? Awesome, thanks. So that's part of my network, and that's happened because I've been involved. It also helps me give back to the community, which makes me feel warm and fuzzy. This talk comes in two parts. First, what the difference is between mentoring and coaching, and second, some tips for both. So what's the difference? So I wrote a few different articles when I was doing some research for this talk, and they all said a few different things. So this is kind of my own personal, too long didn't read definition. So first of all, mentoring is all about the mentee. It's about their life, their goals, and their decisions. It takes a lot of investment from the mentor, both emotionally and time. And it's typically longer term, so that's going to be more involvement emotionally than with time. Coaching, however, is all about skills. It's focused on getting the student better at that particular thing. Generally, it takes less emotional involvement, and it's almost always shorter term, so it's less time for the person involved. But really, most people use them interchangeably. I'm going to do my best to use the correct term throughout this talk, but if you read anything about mentoring or coaching, it's likely that they're mixing them together. Alright, so the second part of the talk is some tips and tricks. So I'll have 7 tips, and each one comes with a story, so hopefully that can help you remember them. First off, your mentee is not your mini-me. They are their own person. They can make their own choices, and you are there to offer advice, but let them have their own path, let that happen for them. So the story for this is that a friend of mine asked me to join her for coffee. She was applying to jobs and she had quite a few offers on the table. She was really having a difficult time choosing which one she wanted to pick. So she asked me if we could get together and sort of talk over her options. So I said yes, but before we got coffee, I had to remind myself to take a step back and remind myself that this is about her. It's about the jobs that's best for her. So I had to think about how I would make this decision, and not which decision I would make. Thankfully, I had actually recently chosen a new job myself, so I kind of had an idea about how I would go about this decision. So when we got together for coffee, we talked about what things were particularly important to her. Was it the location of the office, how swanky it was, how much pay she was getting, the training she'd have on site? We talked about all of those and some other things and asked some follow-up questions to find out which things she cared about. So in the end, she decided to go with a particular company, and it may or may not have been one I would have chosen, but that doesn't matter. She seems pretty happy there now. So the next tip. I've personally never had an official mentor, and to me, it always seemed like such a good idea. Here was someone whose job it is to help me with my life. Isn't that handy? So I always thought this was great. But while I was doing research for this talk, I read a few papers, and it turns out that having a mentor who's assigned to you is no better than having no mentor at all. It doesn't result in more raises or having different job titles. It's generally not a big deal. So being able to choose your mentor or having your mentor choose you, having that initial bond is much more important. This was a big surprise for me and kind of maybe a bit sad that there wouldn't be a huge advantage to having workplace mentors. I talked to a few friends of mine who had official mentors or assigned mentors, and they said it wasn't surprising at all to them, so maybe this isn't news to you, but it was a surprise for me. So while I hope that this talk does help inspire you to pursue mentoring or coaching, please don't start a workplace thing. It's generally not worth the time. So the more people that you have to ask, the more likely you are to get an answer. And the more people you have to ask, the better you can choose somebody to give you an answer, somebody who has those strengths. I know a few people who consider this sort of disloyal, that they have that coach that they go to ask questions. But I bet that if you asked your coach, they would say that was a great idea. Not only does it take less time for them, so that's always nice, but it means that they'll probably be impressed that you're reaching out to other people and asking for advice. So for Rails Girls, we have lots of coaches. We try to have 3 students per coach. This helps spread the load out, so if a student has a question, then there's always somebody around to answer it. But there's also another secret reason that we do this. As a coach, it means that I have somebody else to fall back on as well. There's one guy who always comes along who knows how to install Rails on every system. He's done it on Windows, on Macs, on Linux, on things that have gone halfway through and then blown up. He can just cover all of the bases. I've only ever installed Rails on Mac computers that were clean and everything ran fine. So if I ever have a problem, I can always fall back on him and he can help me out, and together we can answer more questions. Everybody comes with different backgrounds, and it's important to take these into consideration. When you're working with beginners, you need to keep that beginner mindset to help them deal with the problems as they're coming on. So this is one of my favorite stories. I was tutoring a friend of mine in beginner programming, and she was learning about arrays. I had tried a few explanations, and none of them had really stuck for her. So eventually we walked around it a few more times, and she said, it's like shoeboxes. And this model really worked for her. It really made sense. So we talked about how the boxes can have different things in them. We talked about how the first box starts with a 0. And then when we moved on and talked about key value pairs, it's the same boxes, but now they have labels on them. We didn't talk about computer memory and how things are done on the back end. It wasn't relevant to her at the time. Almost every problem has many possible solutions. But of those solutions, there are only a very few that are good. So if you ask somebody to change from a possible solution to a good solution, you always have to talk about why. That explanation can lead to better informed decisions in the future. And if you skip it, they might make that same mistake over and over. Again, in Rails Girls, we have a workshop where we work on an ATM. At each point, you have many possible solutions to the exercise, and the attendees almost always pick the most obvious one. Why wouldn't they? But the next exercise challenges them and asks them to think through that a little bit more, so we can talk about maybe that quick solution that you found wasn't necessarily the best. This happens a lot with magic numbers. It just looks so appealing in the beginning. But then we also talk about how doing another way might be slower, and is it necessarily worth it? Is it worth programming an ATM around $3 bills, or do you leave that off and deal with it later? It's that cost that they need to balance out. But you always see that the next exercise they work on, they slow down just a little bit and think about things a little bit more, and that's what we're there for. I personally think that this explaining the why is particularly important on pull requests, and especially for junior developers. It's easy to say, you need to fix this line to do something else, and it takes much more time and patience to say, and here's why. Don't steal the keyboard. Whatever problem you're working on, you are faster than they are. I know that you're going to be faster, you know you're going to be faster, but I promise you that your student also knows that you'll be faster at solving this than they are. So give them time to make those mistakes, and give them time to practice. Mistakes are part of learning, and if you skip over it, it just won't stick. That's really easy to say, but I'm going to be honest and say I fail at this one all the time. And I think it's particularly difficult because your student really wants you to type for them. They're sitting there working on a problem with you sitting next to them, and they're freaking out. Oh my gosh, just take the keyboard away from me, solve this problem for me, I'm so uncomfortable, you're sitting here watching me like freaking out. It's not where you want to be. And since I've been on both sides of that chair, as the person who's helping them, you're sitting there saying, I can just do this answer, like, we can do this, you got this, give me the keyboard, oh. And it's so hard to hold back on that one. In particular, I was working with a coworker on a problem, and we had sort of gone through it a few times, and then I saw the answer. I just was, this is how it's going to fit together. And I felt like I couldn't hold that solution in my head and explain it to her at the same time. Only one of those things could happen. So I sold the keyboard. What I wish I'd done was to take a second, take a notepad, write down some things about the solution, and sat on my hands and walked through it. It would have helped so much more. Because when we talked about it afterwards, it's already up there, like, it just works. As for the students, I guarantee they will not be upset if you take that little bit of extra time. If anything, this is good news for them. Somebody that they respect enough to ask them to help them needs to take a second to think things through. Like, that's fantastic. Who wouldn't want to know that? And finally, practice. Just like any other skill, you need to practice this. Every time you give an explanation, you can refine it and make it just a little bit better. The first time that I was explaining Git, I really struggled to explain why it was a good idea. I knew the commands, I knew how my team used it, I knew why it was important to us, but selling it to somebody who had never used version control, who wasn't on a distributed team, I just couldn't think it through properly. So I took some time, and the next time that we met up, I came back to her with a story. And I covered some cases where Git might be useful. Yes, we talked about working on a remote team, which she didn't have any experience with, but we also talked about maybe it being useful if you dropped your computer in a puddle. That's something people can really relate to, and it's something you're just generally nervous about. So that gave her some motivation to learn the commands and to stick with it. I've given that same explanation almost 10 times now, and every one is just a little bit better than the time before. So this practice really pays off. There are so many events out there that connect coaches to students. I'll have all of these and their links up on Meetup after the talk. So coaches, if this is something that you want to try out, you can go to any of these events and just dip your toes in the water, see what it's like. If you already know that you're interested in coaching, you can come to any of these and practice it. And students, if you're looking for a coach, these events are awesome because coaches are spontaneously there. They just are people willing to help you out and answer some questions. And maybe you'll gel with somebody who's there and you'll be able to ask some questions outside of these events as well. Either way, for students and coaches, you're guaranteed warm and fuzzies.